In the winter of 1874, a girl walked down off Winterkill Ridge with no shoes, no coat, and frost grown into her hair like a second skin. She was 11 years old. She had been missing for 9 days. When Sheriff Gideon Marsh wrapped her in his own coat and asked her where her family was, she gave him an answer he never wrote down in full. The part he did write down was enough to make 3 grown men refuse to ride back up that ridge. She told him her family was still up there, still moving around inside the house, and then she told him that the thing living with them had learned to wear their faces. To understand why that one sentence emptied a courthouse, you have to understand where Winterkill Ridge sits, and what people already believed about it long before the girl ever came down. Winterkill Ridge is a long spine of stone in the high country of Bellamy County, the kind of place that shows up on the old survey maps under one name and on the new ones under another. The settlers who came through in the middle of the century did not name it. The name was already there when they arrived, carved into a boundary stone at the base of the trail, and nobody living could tell you who had cut it. That is the first strange thing, and it is the kind of strange thing that people who study the older history of this country have started to notice everywhere. Maps do not match. Names arrive before the people who supposedly gave them. Roads lead to towns that were already standing, already paved, already waiting, as if someone had come through, cleared the land of its first tenants, and simply handed the keys to whoever showed up next. The family that settled the top of the ridge was the Otwway family. Silas Otwway, his wife Maren, and their 4 children took the high cabin in the spring of 1871. It was not a new cabin, and that detail matters more than it sounds. The Otwways did not build it. They found it. It stood at the end of the old trail, roofed in slate that no local quarry had ever cut, with a cellar dug deeper than any root cellar has a reason to be, and a hearth wide enough to roast a whole hog standing up. Silas wrote to his brother that the place felt like it had been built for larger people. Those were his exact words, built for larger people. He said the doors were hung too high, the steps were spaced too far apart, and the windows sat at a height where a grown man had to look up to see out of them. For 3 years the Otwways lived on that ridge, and came down to the valley only for salt, powder, and the harvest market. They were quiet people, who kept to themselves and gave nobody any trouble. None of the valley folks could ever say exactly when the change first began, but slowly, over those 3 years, they started to notice that the Otwways were changing. It was small at first. Silas stopped answering to his own name at market, then caught himself and answered a beat too late, the way you do when you are remembering a role instead of living it. Maren bought thread in colours she had never once worn in her life. The oldest boy grew a full head taller in a single season, which happens to boys, except the valley doctor swore the child's teeth had changed shape between one visit and the next, and every one of them, when the light hit them wrong at the trading post, seemed to have a few too many joints in their hands. People talk. In a county that size, people always talk. But nobody did anything, because there was nothing to do. A family being odd is not a crime. A family keeping to a ridge is not a crime. So the valley let the Otwways be, right up until the 9th of December in 1874, when the youngest Otwway child, the girl named Ada, came down the trail alone in the snow, half frozen and entirely without her family, and started telling the sheriff what had really been living in that house with them the whole time. And before we go further, I need to pause for a second, because what I'm about to tell you gets significantly darker. And I realized a while ago that some of this cannot be fully explained in a video format. The complete reconstruction of the account they struck from the county record, what Ada said was wearing her family's faces, the tracks that circled the cabin for 9 nights, Sheriff Marsh's own deposition transcribed word for word. I put it all into a written document. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now let's continue. Ada Otwway was carried into the back room of the county doctor's house and warmed slowly, because you cannot warm a frozen child fast without killing them. For the first full day she did not speak at all. She sat with her knees drawn up under the blanket and watched the door. Not the window, the door. And every time someone opened it, she flinched and counted the person out loud. 1, as if she were keeping careful track of how many things had come into the room and might not be what they looked like. The doctor's wife said the child never once cried. She only counted, and she only watched the hands of everyone who came near her. When she finally talked, Sheriff Marsh was the only one she would talk to, and only if he sat where she could see both of his hands the entire time. That one request tells you something on its own. An ordinary tragedy makes a child want to be held. A child who insists on watching your hands has already learned that hands are the place where the wrongness shows itself first. Here is the account she gave, reconstructed carefully from what Marsh wrote down and from what the doctor's wife remembered hearing through the wall over those long nights. It started, Ada said, about 2 years after they first moved in. Something came up out of the deep cellar. She never said it climbed the stairs. She said it came up the way water comes up, filling the house from the bottom without anyone ever deciding to let it in. At first it only took the small things. The sound of her mother humming would come from a room her mother was not standing in. Her father's boots would be by the door, wet, when her father had not gone out that day. The family would sit down to supper, and there would be one more place set at the table than there were people to fill it, and nobody would admit to setting it, and nobody would dare to clear it away. Then it started taking the family one at a time, not killing them, wearing them. Ada described it the way a child describes something she does not yet have the words for. She said her father went down into the cellar one night to see about a noise, and the thing that came back up the stairs walked like him and talked like him and even laughed like him, and knew things only he could possibly know, but it did not blink when it looked into the fire. It stood in the corners of rooms facing the wall when it thought no one was watching, and it had somehow forgotten which hand her father favoured. One by one, she watched it happen to all of them. Her mother stopped casting a shadow that matched her body. Her brothers began finishing each other's sentences in a voice that belonged to neither of them, and the whole time they kept acting like a family. They said they loved her. Every supper they set her place at the table and called her their girl, telling her that soon she would understand, soon she would be like them, soon she would come down into the cellar herself and finally meet the real head of the house. The most chilling detail Ada gave was not about the monster. It was about the manners. She said the thing wearing her family was unfailingly polite. It never raged. It never chased her through the house like something in a story. Instead, it simply waited, wore the people she loved, and asked her, gently, every single night at supper, whether she was ready yet to go downstairs and be made whole with the rest of them. What kept her alive was a habit her real mother had taught her back before any of this began, a small bedtime rhyme where you name each person in the house and say good night to them in turn. Ada kept doing it. Every night she named, they wished good night to a grandmother who had died long before Ada was even born. Some nights they counted a child who had never existed at all, a fifth Otwway who had no name and no face, only a place at the table. And that was how she knew that none of them were truly her family anymore. The rhyme was a lock, and the thing had every key except the one that actually mattered, which was love, which it could copy but could not carry. On the 9th night, the rhyme failed completely. She said good night to her family, and every single voice in that house answered her back at once, from every room, in perfect unison, all of them using her mother's voice, and they told her that the waiting was finally over. So Ada climbed out the too-high window, dropped down into the snow, and walked down an entire mountain in the dark with no shoes, rather than spend one more night being loved by the things at the bottom of the stairs. That is the point where most people hearing this story decide it has to be a folk tale. A frightened child, a brutal winter, a family that likely died of fever or something worse, and a young mind that built a monster in order to survive the memory of losing them. That is the reasonable explanation, and it is a comforting one, and every instinct in a sensible person reaches for it. Sheriff Marsh reached for it too. He believed it himself, for exactly as long as it took him to ride up the ridge and see the house with his own eyes. Before we move on to what the search party found, stop for a second. What you just heard about the rhyme that failed on the 9th night is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to the sheriff's original ledger. The wrong names. The extra child. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back. Because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. Sheriff Marsh took 2 men up Winterkill Ridge on the 11th of December, 3 days after Ada came down. Only Marsh came back willing to talk about any of it, and what he described only once. in a deposition that was later quietly removed from the county record and replaced with a single flat line stating that the Otwway family was presumed lost to the winter. The original pages were never found again. Somebody wanted that account gone, and somebody had the authority to make it happen. Here is what he said the first time he told it. Sitting in the doctor's kitchen with his hands shaking around a cup of coffee he never once drank, before anyone in the county thought to tell him he ought to be quiet about it. The house was empty. That was the first wrong thing. Not ransacked, not bloodied, not burned, but empty and clean and warm. The fire was still going strong, days after a family of 6 had supposedly frozen or fled. 6 places were set neatly at the table. The food on the plates was still fresh and still faintly steaming in the cold. And laid across the head chair, folded with terrible care, were the clothes of every member of the Otwway family, arranged in the exact shape of the person who had worn them, sleeves crossed over chests, boots set below the trousers, bonnets resting where the heads should be, as if the people inside those clothes had simply been drawn out through the collar and carried off somewhere else. The second wrong thing was the cellar. Marsh said the stairs went down farther than the hill itself was tall. He counted the steps on the way down, and lost the count somewhere past 60, in a cellar cut into a ridge that did not have 60 steps of depth to give. The walls changed as he descended. Timber became stone. Stone became something smooth and fitted, and cut with a precision no frontier hand could ever manage, the joints so tight he could not slide a knife blade between the blocks, the same impossible masonry that people have started finding underneath old cities, underneath old star forts, underneath buildings that history insists were thrown up in a single summer by ordinary men with ordinary hand tools. He said the air down there was warm, and it moved, and it smelled like a church that had been sealed shut for 100 years. At the very bottom, in a room that should not have been able to fit inside the mountain at all, Marsh found the thing Ada had been trying so hard to describe. He would never say what it looked like. Not to the court, not to his wife, not to anyone, for the rest of his life. He would only ever say that it was seated, that it was patient, that it was very old, and that it wore, folded, and waiting across its lap, a small dress that had not yet been filled. Ada's dress, cut precisely to her size, made and set aside before she was ever born, the way you lay out clean clothes for a guest you already know is coming. And beside it, he said, were 5 more sets of clothing, folded just as neatly, in sizes he did not recognize, waiting for guests who had not yet arrived. Marsh left the ridge that day and never once went back. He resigned his post within the year. The 2 men who went up with him left the county entirely, and one of them, according to a letter his family kept for generations, spent the rest of his life refusing to sleep in any house that had a cellar, and would only stay in single-story rooms with the solid floor pressed flat beneath him. He wrote that he did not fear death. He wrote that he feared being kept. Those were the words he used, being kept, and he underlined them twice. Now here is where this stops being a simple ghost story and starts being something that should genuinely bother you, long after the video is over and the screen goes dark and you are the one alone in a house at night. The people who research the buried history of this continent, the reset, the mud flood, the cities that appear on old maps fully formed and then vanish without a trace, keep colliding with the exact same pattern that runs straight through the middle of Ada Otwway's account. Buildings too large for the people who supposedly raised them. Doorways hung high, steps spaced wide, hearths sized for something a great deal bigger than us. Masonry that clearly predates the settlers who claim to have laid it. And, over and over again in the oldest records, the same haunted phrase written down by frightened hands. The land was not empty when we came. Something was already living here, and for a time it let us stay. You can read that sentence in a dozen different county archives, in a dozen different hands, from towns that never once spoke to each other, and it is always some version of the very same warning. Ada's story is not unique, and that is the part almost nobody wants to sit with for very long. Pull the county histories of nearly any high ridge in this country, and you will eventually find a version of it. A family moves into a house they did not build. The house is too big in ways they cannot quite explain to anyone. They change. They grow quiet. Their neighbours stop recognizing them. And then one hard winter they are simply gone. and the only thing left behind is a set of clothes folded into the shape of a person and a cellar that goes down too far. The details shift from valley to valley, but the bones of it always stay the same. It reads less like a legend spreading slowly from town to town and far more like a single true thing happening again and again in the same kind of place. Wherever the old world left one of its houses standing with the deep room still intact underneath it, patient and warm and waiting for the next family foolish enough to move in. What was living with the Otwways was not a ghost, and it was not a devil. Those are simply the words we reach for, because they are the only words we happen to have. The thing in the deep cellar of Winterkill Ridge behaved like something that held a claim. It did not attack the family. Instead, it absorbed them, slowly and patiently, the way a landlord absorbs a lease that has finally come due. A place was set for the guest. A dress was kept ready and waiting. The thing was polite because, in its own mind, it was not intruding at all. It was collecting what it believed it was owed. And the reason it terrified a hardened frontier sheriff so completely was not that it was monstrous, but that it was orderly, and that its order was older than the county, older than the maps, older even than the name someone had carved into that boundary stone before the very first settler ever arrived. Ada Otwway lived. She was sent away to relatives in another state, far from any ridge, and she grew up, and she married, and she almost never spoke of Winterkill Ridge again for the rest of her long days. Never again would she keep a house that had a cellar, and never again would she sleep on a ground floor. And every single night, without fail, right up until she was a very old woman, she said her good-night rhyme out loud before she let herself sleep. But she left behind one instruction that her own children remembered and passed down through the family, and it is the note this whole story has to end on, because it is the closest thing we have to a warning from someone who actually walked back up out of that valley alive. She told her children never to live in a house they had not watched being built with their own eyes, no matter how cheap it was and no matter how empty it looked. If it ever felt too big, if the doors were hung too high, or the steps sat too far apart, or the cellar went down farther than the ground had any right to allow, they were to walk away and keep walking and never look back at the windows. A house that was already finished and waiting when you arrived, she said, is a house that someone else finished, and someone else is still waiting inside it, and the simple fact that they have not yet come up the stairs to greet you does not mean the house is empty. It only means you have not been invited down yet. She made every one of her children repeat that back to her until they had it word for word, the same way she had once made herself repeat the goodnight rhyme, as a lock against the thing that copies everything except the love. Winterkill Ridge is still there today. The cabin, by most accounts, is not. But the boundary stone still remains at the base of the old trail, with a name on it that nobody cut and that nobody can read the whole of anymore. And every few decades a family with far more hope than sense buys the high parcel and moves in, and for a little while the valley sees their lights burning up on the ridge at night, and then, on some hard winter, the lights go out, and the county files another single line, presumed lost to the season. And the house, if it is still standing up there at all, quietly sets one more place at the table and waits, with that same terrible patience it has always had, for whoever comes next up the too high steps, into the rooms built for larger people, above the cellar that goes down and does not stop where the mountain ends. It has all the time in the world, it always has, and it only ever needed you to move in.